Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Plan, Install, Configure, and Manage Client Access. It's a primary topic for the 70-341 certification exam for Core Solutions with Exchange 2013. The subtopic we're discussing in this lesson is Deploy and Manage Mobility Solutions. Within the subject Deploy and Manage Mobility Solutions, this objective may include, but is not limited to, deploy mobile web app, or MOA, configure Outlook web app policies, configure Microsoft ActiveSync policies, configure Allow Block Quarantine, and manage agaves. And no, I'm not exactly sure I'm saying that word correctly. Taking a look at our scenario, the company we're going to work with in this lesson is Homeworkers Incorporated. They need Exchange 2013 to be configured for mobility. So we're going to walk them through all of the options for mobile configuration. Okay, so let's get started. Typically, in these lessons, we do not review the objectives. And in fact, in all of the lessons, this is the only one where we will review the objectives themselves. And the reason for this is because there is a bit of a disconnect between the objectives as they currently exist at the time of this recording and what was actually released by the Exchange team. For example, Mobile Outlook Web App. Now, some have initially confused this to be Outlook Web App Mini. Outlook Web App Mini is also called Outlook Mobile Access. It's a lightweight browser-based client that works like the old OMA client or Outlook Mobile Access that we know from Exchange 2003. It had very simple features, access to email, access to calendar and contacts, very little in terms of graphics, and you access it through the OMA directory. Now, this was done away with after Exchange 2003, but it was brought back as Outlook Web App Mini with Exchange 2010 Service Pack 2. But Outlook Web App Mini is not included in Exchange 2013. Outlook Web App actually looks pretty good on tiny screens and mobile phones, so they yanked Outlook Web App Mini. Although maybe they'll put it back. It went away from Exchange 2003 and they brought it back, so who knows. But currently, Outlook Web App Mini is not included in Exchange 2013. So what about Mobile Outlook Web App? What is that? Well, this is actually supposed to be Microsoft's provided mobile apps for Android and iOS. But currently there isn't more to say on the matter. They haven't released this at the time of this recording, so we'll have to wait and see. So in terms of objectives, there's really not much more to say about Mobile Outlook Web App. And so that, again, is why we're discussing the objectives, because there is a bit of a disconnect between the objectives as they were released for the certification exam and what you really need to know for the certification exam. Now, what about Outlook Web App policies? We do have Outlook Web App policies to configure, so we'll take a look at that. What about configuring Microsoft ActiveSync policies? Well, we don't have ActiveSync policies. Well, we do, but they aren't called that. Now they're called Mobile Device Mailbox Policies. And you'll also find that some of the settings that we used to be able to configure through the Exchange Management Console as part of an ActiveSync policy, well, they've been yanked from the GUI, and now the only way to configure them is through the Exchange Management Shell. So we'll talk about that in a moment. As for Allow Block Quarantine, ABQ, well, that actually is no longer called that. That's called Mobile Device Access. And with that, you can configure per device access. So we'll discuss this in a bit as well. Now, what exactly is agaves? And again, I may not know how to say it properly, but basically, this is apps for Office. So in our case, we're specifically looking at apps for Outlook. And so with these apps, which can be created by Microsoft or really any third-party developer, the ability is there to extend the application to bring third-party functionality to Office clients in a safe way. And what's cool about this, you'll be able to see in a moment, is that these apps can be provided either through the Microsoft Office Marketplace or they can come from third-party organizations that you download the apps and then you can connect to them from there. So there's a lot of way to snap in these apps for your organization. All right, so now that we've reviewed the objectives and we have a better understanding as to what we're talking about going forward, let's jump over to our server. We're going to spend the rest of the time in this lesson going over the different features because this is a configuration lesson. You note that everything is really about configuration and management, so we're going to spend most of our time clicking through the settings so that you have a clear understanding regarding how you would configure these various policies and settings. Alright, so here we are in the Exchange Admin Center, and at this stage in the game, if you're studying for the 70-341 exam, these are concepts and ideas and subjects that you should already be familiar with. This should not be the first time you're hearing about Outlook web app policies, for two reasons. Either you're a pre-existing Exchange admin who has worked with Exchange 2007 or 2010, and you're really looking to upgrade your skills to 2013. So maybe you haven't seen the Outlook web app policies in the Exchange Admin Center just yet. If you're not working in a lab environment and don't have this set up on your own, then you may not have seen this. But you should know what the concepts are because they're pretty much the same as 2007 and 2010. And let's say you're a newbie to Exchange. Well, this shouldn't be your starting point for learning Exchange. Hopefully you've watched the Exchange 2013 administration course, worked with Exchange a little bit, hopefully in a lab environment, maybe even a work environment, and now you're really just getting fine-tuned and focused on the certification exam aspects of Exchange 2013. And that's really the purpose of these lessons. So here we're looking at Outlook web app policies, and we have a default policy and we have one that we created in a previous lesson. So we're looking at this, and if we just open up the default, you can see we have a policy name. Here are the various features, whether it's instant messaging, text messaging, unified messaging, and so you can turn these features on or off for the OWA mailbox policy. Public folders and journaling, security aspects, junk email filtering, and so forth. Premium client. Now this is interesting because you can make it so that your users that have a policy applied that, let's say you don't want them to get the premium client, you want them to get OWA Lite, regardless of the browser they're using, well, you can actually deselect this option here for premium client. We click more options and you can see time management and so forth. If we go to file access, here we see public and private, direct file access, or web-ready document viewing. We discussed some of these aspects of things when it comes to web-ready document viewing or force web-ready document viewing in another lesson where we talk about the Office Web App Server. Then we have offline access, and with browsers that have HTML5, there's an ability to use Outlook Web App offline, and that's actually connected to the abilities of the browser, but you can make it so that Outlook Web App is not accessible. You can say never if you don't want them to utilize offline access. So those are your Outlook Web App policy settings. Obviously, you can click the plus sign, and when you click the plus sign, it kind of shows you everything all at once here. Everything but the offline settings, apparently. So that's Outlook Web App. On the recipient side, you can apply only one OWA policy per person, so you can configure different policies for different types of users. Jumping over to the mobile settings, you can see here mobile device access and mobile device mailbox policies. So let's talk for a moment about mobile device mailbox policies, because this is what we previously knew as ActiveSync policies. So you can see here that it still relates to ActiveSync, and we have the ability to make changes to the policy. But what's odd, if you're used to working with the Exchange Management Console and you're working through the GUI, is that there were more settings in the GUI. So here, if we click the plus sign, you can see we can provide a name, we can indicate if it's the default or not, allow mobile devices that don't fully support these policies to synchronize. So this was originally termed allow non-provisionable devices, and perhaps you can recall that from previous versions of Exchange. The term itself, non-provisionable devices, was somewhat confusing, and so this is a lot clearer, I think, especially for newbies to Exchange. And then you see the policy for Exchange ActiveSync. Again, there's that word, so it's not wrong to call it the ActiveSync policy. It's just that they've changed the name to Mobile Device Mailbox Policy. And here we can require a password, and here are all of the password settings. So you say, okay, so maybe we set up this new policy, and then we can go in and we can make changes to it, some of the more advanced settings that we're used to seeing perhaps in previous versions. But if we look at the default policy and we open that up, you can see here it just has two tabs, General and Security. For the life of me, I haven't been able to figure out why the premium settings are not included. It's a little bit odd that they don't include the premium settings. But if you look at the TechNet article that's referenced at the end of this lesson under additional research, create or modify a mobile device mailbox policy, you can see here that it says you can use the EAC to create a new mobile device mailbox policy. But notice this note here, it says you can only set a subset of mobile device mailbox policy settings in the EAC. To set all the mobile device mailbox policy settings, you need to use the shell. So there are other settings. If we scroll down, you can see here in the shell, you can use the new mobile device mailbox policy, or if you're looking to change an existing policy, you can use the set mobile device mailbox policy. And you can see here that there's a lot that you can do, whether it's allow text messaging, allow storage card, whether or not you allow POP or IMAP support. There's a lot that you can do through the Exchange Management Shell. Notice that it says here there's a warning. There are two commandlets that can be used to edit a mobile device mailbox policy, the set-ActiveSync mailbox policy and the set-mobile device mailbox policy. They perform identical tasks. It says here, in a future version of Microsoft Exchange, the set-ActiveSync mailbox policy commandlet will be removed. We recommend that you update your scripts and procedures to use the set-mobile device mailbox policy. So that's something to keep in mind. Currently this one still works, but it's going to be discontinued. So this is really the one going forward. Now if we jump over to the Exchange Management Shell, just like any other commandlet, if we wanted to get help when it comes to the various parameters and settings of a commandlet, we can type in get help and then in this case set mobile device mailbox policy, and we hit enter. Alright, and so from here you can see all of the different parameters, and really it's not just parameters, but it's helping us to appreciate the different settings that we have control over. Now, some of these are settings that we have control over through the GUI, because they relate back to the password settings that we can configure. But other settings are related to what we can do when it comes to the various settings for our mobile devices. And another thing to keep in mind is that depending on the mobile device, some of these settings may or may not work. So you need to know the mobile device that you're working with and how ActiveSync works with that device in order to know if the settings that you configure will work. And then of course if we look at the settings themselves, we recall that there is that setting, allow mobile devices that don't fully support these policies to synchronize. So if this isn't selected, then those devices that don't support the policies, if we unselect this, they won't be able to synchronize. So again, that comes down to the non-provisionable side to the discussion. If you create a policy and all of your mobile devices can't apply that policy, well then you're kind of stuck. So how do you know if your policy is going to comply with the phones you're working with? Well, it takes a little bit of research on your part, but you can see here in TechNet it does give some guidelines with supported mobile device mailbox policies for Windows phones and devices. And here you can see that depending on the type of Windows phone you're using, you can see the different policy settings for the phone depending on the version of Exchange. Here we see Windows 8 supported policy parameters, so there have been improvements there. And here you can see Windows 8 and Windows RT supported policy parameters as well. So that's very helpful to know what policy settings are configurable depending on the device that you're working with. Now going back to the other side to mobile settings, the other tab here, there's the mobile device access. This is the Allow Block Quarantine side to the mobile device settings. And notice it says allow synchronization with mobile devices that aren't managed by rules or personal exemptions. Now there's an article at the end of the lesson in the additional research section, and it links off to a blog column by Chris Goosen, who wrote about controlling ActiveSync device access on Exchange 2013. So imagine you're looking at a situation where you want to allow all sorts of different devices, perhaps you're in the BYOD world and you don't have a problem with people using different devices, but let's say you want to specifically block the use of iPads. Maybe they're not devices that are issued by the company, maybe you just have a problem with iPads for your environment and they're not approved. So you want to have an open environment where folks can connect up, but you want to be able to eliminate devices and quarantine them so you can see who is actually trying to attempt to use a device, how many devices are out there. Maybe you can even create policies that are specific to that device. So here you can see that we don't have any quarantine devices currently or device access rules. We can edit the settings that currently exist. And by default, you can see the settings here that when a mobile device that isn't managed by a rule or personal exemption connects to Exchange, we're very permissive. We have allowed access. Now we can change that. We can say let's block access. We can say let's quarantine the device. And if that's the case, then we can decide later whether or not we want to allow it. Now, at the same time, we can also establish a quarantine notification email. Let's say we want that to go right to us as the administrator. So when the mobile device is quarantined, we'll get an email, and then text to include in messages sent to users whose mobile device is in quarantine, blocked, or in the process of being identified. So we can establish a specific message, otherwise they'll get the default message. So it's pretty much as easy as that to adjust the default settings there. At the same time, we have these device access rules over here. And it's here that we're able to define devices and device families that are problematic for our organization. So we click the plus sign here, and you can see the new device access rule wizard comes up, and we can choose a device family and a model. Now the thing is, this actually gets propagated with information depending on the type of devices that have connected up in our environment. So in a lab environment, we really don't have much to show. If we click Browse, you can see we can choose all families, we can choose EAS probe device type. So if we choose all families and we choose Browse here, we're not going to see anything. We're going to see EAS probe device type. We say OK. But really, if we had iPads and other devices, it would show as part of the different device families and the different models there. So then we could actually determine if we want all models or if we want specific models, and then what we're going to do with those specific devices. Or, if we'd like, we can actually create a rule for a device family or for a specific model, so that that rule applies over those devices. So this is actually pretty neat that we have this kind of control, and it's not all that complicated to work with here. If we did have a device access rule that quarantined iPads, then if someone did try to connect up with an iPad, it would go up here in quarantine devices, and we would get an email at that point that would let us know as the administrator that someone has tried to set their system up using an iPad. And then we can decide at that point if we want them to use that device or not. Now the last thing we want to talk about are those Agave apps, or apps for Office, or in this case, apps for Outlook. If we go over to Organization, under Apps, we see it says apps let your users do and see more without leaving their mailbox. The following list shows apps that have been installed for the organization. So these are apps that were installed by default. Action items, Bing Maps, Suggested, Meetings, and Unsubscribe. Now, these are there by default. What's nice about this is if, let's say, you have an end user that gets an email with an address, automatically, because Bing Maps is enabled and provided to everyone, as you can see here, the end user will be able to see the Bing map right in their Outlook. So that's pretty cool. But you might be wondering, what other apps are there? Well, there's actually quite a bit. If we click the little drop-down arrow, we can add from the Office Store, add from a URL, or add from a file. Let's click Add from the Office Store. And here you see it takes us to the Microsoft Office store where we have the productivity apps for Outlook. As we scroll down, you can see that some of the apps are free, like LinkedIn for Outlook, and some of them are just for Outlook web app, like this conversation filter, and others are for Outlook 2013 and Outlook web app. And so it really just depends. So you can scroll through and see which ones you like. Some of them don't give us a lot of information, so we may need to do a little bit more research on them. But once we decide on one, for example here, LinkedIn for Outlook, this has 3 stars from 19 different persons. Once we decide, we can select it. It gives us more information about this. We click Add. It says, please confirm you want to install this app. Alright, so now if we go back to Apps here, notice now we have LinkedIn. And so here you can see we have the LinkedIn app right there. Now, the end user at that point has the ability to enable the LinkedIn app. It's not enabled by default for the end user. And the end user can also choose for themselves additional apps that they may want to snap into their Outlook. So right from their own desktops, they can go in and acquire other apps that they want to work with as well. Alright, and that's pretty much it when it comes to mobile device settings and so forth. We have the ability to work with the Outlook web app policies. We have the ability to work under mobile with mobile device policies and various access settings for allow, block, and quarantine. And here we have this new Agave, that was the code name for it, apps for Office, or apps in this case for Outlook. And we can add in additional apps right here. And that will enhance the end user experience when it comes to working with either Outlook or Outlook web app. Let's jump back over to our slides and let's review our scenario and close out the discussion. Alright, so in this lesson, we reviewed the configuration options for Outlook web app, for ActiveSync mobile device connections, and for apps for Office, more specifically apps for Outlook. And this was a fun one. It's always nice when you can just go through the settings, look at the different configuration options. But remember, although much of what we discussed can be handled through the EAC, more advanced mobile policy settings can only be addressed through the Exchange Management Shell. For additional research, I recommend you take a look at the following articles. The first one is Create or Modify a Mobile Device Mailbox Policy. The second is an article entitled Controlling ActiveSync Device Access on Exchange 2013. And the third is Overview of Apps for Office. So we hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.